Okay, well, welcome. Hello. Glad to see. Didn't scare everybody off. That's good. Well, I don't suppose we have any new OLLI members here today, do we? Well, we do. Well, welcome. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to anybody. I'm sure they'd be glad to help you, including myself. And I'm glad you're here. And if you don't know, I don't have a sheet on me, but there will be a free lunch for new members. So you might want to, stop and have a free lunch.
Friday, October 4th.
Thank you. Friday, October 4th, free lunch.
Sunny Slope from 11:30 to 1.
But you got to call Shawnee and tell her. Okay, otherwise they're not going to give you a free lunch. But anyway, thank you so much for coming. Glad to be here, that you're here, and certainly hope you enjoyed the class. Alrighty then. Someone asked me last week about soldiers of fortune. And I won't mention any names. And I did not find out the origin of that term. I did look pretty thoroughly. I did a bunch of searches on it and never really could come up with anything more than a dictionary definition of what that was. But a soldier of fortune, of course, is a mercenary. But the actual term soldier of fortune, I'm sorry, unable to track where that term came from. So anyway, as always, if you have a question that I cannot answer, we will start the next class with that question. Hopefully I will be able to answer it, not this time. So, all right, well, today's show is the land war after the first industrial revolution. So you may remember that the industrial revolution started around 1770. It ends roughly in 1840. The second industrial revolution starts around 1867 and ends in 1914. I don't know what they did between those years, but apparently there wasn't an industrial revolution going on, at least historically. All right, so what drives the first industrial revolution? It is steam power. We probably all have a car and are familiar with the engine in your car. The engine in your car is an internal combustion engine. So if gasoline or diesel, depending on what you have, gets in, it explodes, it pushes a piston down, the piston has a connecting rod, the rod turns a crankshaft, that turns your flywheel, and that drives your car. Steam engines are slightly different than that in the fact that they are external combustion engines. So what we have is we have a boiler of water, we heat that water, and then once it turns into steam, we begin to send that steam into the piston, and again, that will drive the piston. So significantly different than your car, certainly more bulky generally. But that is what drove that first industrial revolution. Well, steam power has an incredibly long history. It was known for many, many years previously. And there's some thoughts that it would have been able to drive stuff as far back as Archimedes-like time, had they really come to the conclusions that came later, that you would have seen steam power perhaps being used as early as perhaps Rome. But it didn't. So anyway, James Watt, who I think most of you are familiar with, he is the guy that basically comes up with the idea of how to make steam power more practical. What he does is he uses low pressure steam to drive that piston and then has a condenser to collect that moisture and then refeed that back, makes the thing much more efficient. So he radically changes that. But his steam engines were primarily to pump water. They're not they're large too. And he does come up with a plan. If you look here, there would be the piston, and he came up with this beam idea. So the piston pushes the beam up, and that will turn the wheel. So indeed, that becomes more effective for creating machine tools. So you can drive more things than just pumping water. But still, it's a relatively large and ineffective methodology. Now, one thing about Mr. Watt, and I thought that was cool, Well, he powers the first revolution. We got that. So one thing about him, he was really, really protective of his patents. So he didn't want anybody making a lot of profit on steam power, even though there were many people that would realize that there was a better way to do this than what he had developed. And that brings us to this guy, Trevithick. Richard Trevithick, very interesting to me, gets the first patent for high pressure steam. So high pressure steam power is going to be much more effective, and it allows for a couple of other things. First of all, your engine is going to be much smaller, and the second thing it's going to do is the engine is going to be much more powerful. Trevithick does a couple other things too. He creates the first railroad engine. He creates the first train that actually pulls a load as a test. The problem with that is the rails that he used for that were designed for horse wagons, not for the heavy locomotive he did, and he damaged all the rails, so the person that let him do the test was a little less than happy. But most fun, I think, is he created the Puffing Devil. And the Puffing Devil, you can see here a recreation of it, and it is the first steam-powered vehicle that actually moved people around. So he would take this thing out for a little test ride, and one day he's got 6 guys with him, and they're all riding around on the Puffing Devil, and they hit a rut in the road and it gets stuck. Well, they figure, you know what, we'll come back to this. So they all head to the pub, and they start drinking and eating some roast goose, as the report goes. Well, they forget to turn off the fuel in the boiler, and indeed the Puffing Devil becomes the Burning Devil. And he's not particularly brokenhearted about this, because he's like, well, it was just operator error. So I think he's kind of fun because he just abandons this thing and goes drinking. So anyway, so he does high pressure steam. And high pressure steam really is what changes the first industrial revolution, because now you can make things much smaller, they're much more efficient, and efficiency of steam engines as we go along will become much and much more greater as time goes on. But at this time, he has created the first locomotive, and these same engines will power early steamships, so that will replace wind and muscle power to drive navies as well, and we'll see that next week. Well, so that leads us to railroads. And railroads are incredibly important for military use, because now what you can do is you can have your troops moved not by wagon or whatever, but you can have them moved by rail, and you can move them much faster and much more efficiently. So railroads become very important to add mobility to not just the men themselves, but also to their logistics. And you would see that they would generally, what people would do previous to this is they would use rivers. Well, now you basically have freed yourself from rivers. But in the South, many of the railway lines are built so they connect up to ports and rivers, because they're trying to get commercial goods, cotton, for example, moved to these ports. So the southern railroads are quite a bit different, really, than the way the railroads are built in the north, and that will have an effect on Civil War as well. So nearly all the locomotives made are made in the north. Virtually nothing is made in the south as far as railway engines. So the South, when it begins the war, has a difficult situation in the fact that they don't have the capability to get a lot of trains. They can either use what they start with, they can capture them from the north, or because of the blockade of the South by the Union Navy, is they will be able to get a few locomotives in from Britain, for example. So they have a big problem with that, and because of wear and tear and war damage, etc., by 1865, their railroad system is virtually dysfunctional. It's really not useful anymore. So both sides, of course, know that the train is going to be important in war. They know that, that they're going to be made out of iron, because steel is very difficult to make this time. Iron has become much more readily available in the Industrial Revolution. but steel is still not there. It will not be available for some time yet. And so basically these trains are made out of iron. And the rails now are made out of iron as well. And if you want to destroy a railroad, what you do is you take those rails and you put them on a big pile of wood and you heat up the middle, and then you take them and wrap them around a tree, and then that rail can no longer be used. So that's a way to totally make railroads or destroy railroads at this time. Well, another big invention that takes place at this time is the telegraph. So in 1840, Morse does two things. He creates a single wire system. There were telegraphs previous to Morse, but they used two wires, and they had another problem, is they didn't use relays. So they had a very, very short range. They didn't have capability. Maybe you could make it go 10 miles is all you could do with the electrical charge available. Well, he comes up with a single wire system and puts a relay on that, and that relay will then help boost the power down the line. So you put a relay every so often, and now the thing can go much, much farther. And the other thing he does is he creates the Morse code. Well, Morse, again, is another one of these interesting characters, in my opinion. That Morse, the way he decides to get involved with this is he's a very, very famous portrait painter. And he's very well-to-do. And he's out on a commission, and he gets a horse-delivered message that his wife is critically ill. He begins to pack up his stuff, and he's trying to leave the next morning to go home and see his wife. And when he gets a message, another horse-delivered message the next morning that his wife has indeed died. He's brokenhearted by this, and he decides that he is going to try to find a way to make communication much quicker. And because he's got a lot of rich friends and he hangs around with the right people, he actually has the capability to do this. So he's a very smart guy, but he also has a lot of help. So, the other thing about Morse is he's a nativist. He does not want a lot of immigration into the United States. And the type of immigration he doesn't want is he doesn't want Catholics. So he wants Catholics not to come to the United States because he's terribly afraid that Catholics indeed are going to take over the country. He has a deal where he blames Austria for intentionally shipping Catholics to the United States so that eventually that Catholicism will become the primary religion of the country. He runs for mayor of New York on this platform, and New York decidedly goes against him. He receives less than 1,500 votes, so apparently they're not nativist in New York at that time. But anyway, that's a little bit about Morse. So, a variation of his Morse code becomes the world standard. In only 18 years from his first development of this thing, he is able to make a cable that goes from England to Labrador, so he is able to cross the Atlantic Ocean with this information in only 18 years. So it's incredibly fast. That particular cable does not last long. It is, they really don't have a good handle on what they're doing. And it's starting to fail after 3 weeks, and what they think maybe will work is take a big electric charge and fire it through that cable. Well, when they do that, of course, they burn up the cable. So it only lasts 3 weeks. 1866, an entirely new cable is put in that lasts much longer. So we can see in only 18 years, we now have the capability to have instantaneous communication from Europe to the United States. The United States is incredibly into the telegraph, much more so than most other countries. It is supported by the government, and the reason primarily is that the United States is just big. So they need more, there's more useful communication in the fact that the United States is such a large place. And so there's 22,000 miles of telegraph cable in the United States by the 1850s. So it's really government supported. All right, so we've covered all those things. let's see where they fit in. So the first battle of Bull Run, or you may prefer to refer to it as Manassas, is fought on July 21st, 1861. Manassas Junction is about 25 miles southwest of Washington, D.C. The armies at this time are both very new. They're full of not conscripts, but primarily volunteers. The Union, under Lincoln, has called for volunteers to fight for 90 days. It's a very short time to train an army and then send it to war, but that's what they had done. It's kind of a militia tradition in the United States at this time. And so both sides are really inexperienced, but there's a lot of pressure on the Union side to get these people into combat. First of all, the Southerners are only 25 miles away. And second of all, these guys a lot of their terms are expiring. So they want to get into battle quickly. Well, McDowell, who's in charge of the Union Army at this time, says, you know, we're not really ready for this. But he is basically pressured into going to war and taking the offensive. Well, he comes up with the idea, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a flanking maneuver. So I'm going to try to get around the Confederates and not attack them head on, but get behind them. And he knows that he has 35,000 men. He knows that Beauregard, who is at Manassas, has 22,000, so he has a significant advantage in troops. But he also knows that there's over 10,000 Confederates in the Shenandoah Valley. And he wants his subordinate, he has another army over there of about 18,000, I believe, under Patterson. And he wants Patterson to pin that Shenandoah army to there so it can't be used to reinforce the army he's going to attack. Well, that doesn't quite work out for him because of Rose O'Neal Greenhow. She is a Confederate spy. She is significantly connected to Washington. She is one of those, she's kind of like a party girl. She has numerous connections in Washington at this time. There are numerous politicians, etc., that are not really poorly disposed towards the South. Many of them actually sympathize with the Southern cause, including her boyfriend, who is on basically a military committee in the U.S. government. So obviously he's giving her tons and tons of information too. She has actually a secret code, and she goes and uses the telegraph and telegraphs Beauregard that, hey, the Yankees are coming. Well, what he does then is he telegraphs Johnston with the Army of the Shenandoah and says, hey, you need to move your army and start to support me because I'm going to be under attack and I need more troops. Well, if you see this picture here, what Johnston does is he leaves a small force at Winchester to detain Patterson's force and basically fool him. He marches down the valley and catches a railroad. And he takes the railroad all the way over to Manassas. But you can only do this a little bit at a time. The trains are not efficient enough for him to move his entire force at one time. But he begins in dribs and drabs to transfer his military. So again, we see now the telegraph and the railroad have had a huge effect on what's going to be the first major battle of this war. Well, there's two people that are very critical in this battle that are with Johnston. One is General Bee, and the other one is an unknown former colonel who is now a teacher at the VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, named Thomas Jackson. And Bee has 2,600 men. These are a little better trained, really. And Jackson has 2,000 men, and they are both going to be transferred on this railroad. Well, Patterson has completely failed in his efforts to keep Johnston from moving his army, and that was a key part of McDowell's plan. Unfortunately for them, now they've got the situation where there's a much larger Confederate force is going to face McDowell. The other thing about McDowell is, as I said, his troops are really, really poorly trained. And they're really, really poorly disciplined. So as they're marching in this battle, to the battle, they decide, well, you know, I'm kind of hungry. Let's stop and get some fruit. And so they pick some fruit off the trees, and they just take breaks whenever they wanted. And it takes him over 2 days to march to Manassas, this 25-mile distance, which is very, very slow. If he had moved much quicker, obviously, there would have been a much better chance that he would win this battle. But he doesn't, and the troops are just really not very well disciplined. Another factor is some of these troops, their 90 days ends up. And so they're marching along, and all of a sudden, hey, our 90 days are up. And McDowell goes and says, look, I really need you guys to help me fight this battle. And they're like, well, you know, I really don't like the Army very much. So they decide to say, heck with it, and march back to Washington. This is really strange compared to a military would be today, that you would have people doing things like this. But that's how it went. And so on July 21st, the Union Army finally launches its attack. And we're going to show this real quick here. This is Stone Bridge. They're going to have a fake attack there. And that is to keep this Evans unit busy. Then they're going to march the bulk of their troops over Bull Run and come in from the north. And then the idea is they will crush the Confederate line that way. Also at the same time, Kirby Smith, who will become very important later on, his trains are just now arriving into the Manassas Junction. So you can see that it's a pretty good plan, and if they had done it quicker, it certainly could have been probably much more successful. Now, I believe, Judy, you had mentioned about Semaphore last week, and indeed, this battle is the first use of what's known as wigwag semaphore in military history. So indeed, semaphore does play a part, but the part it plays is the fact that the battle really hasn't started yet. And so there's not a lot of smoke from all the firing. But that's really the issue there. So Evans is warned by a wigwag semaphore that he's going to get flanked by this large Union army. So what he does is he says, you know, I don't think this Stone Bridge thing is real. And he takes 900 of his 1,100 men and tries to stop the Union army. Well, that's not enough guys. He doesn't have a prayer, but he makes an effort. And at this same time, Johnston and Beauregard show up, and they look at what's going on, and they're like, uh-oh. So they put in B's unit and Bartow's unit. Remember, B came in by railroad, and said, you guys got to go and try to stop this Union attack. Well, they're doing pretty good, but then all of a sudden, as we will see here, a guy named Sherman, who will come in this lecture later, he leads a force over this little fork here, Farm Ford, and he is now on the flank of B and Bartow. Well, that causes B and Bartow to have to withdraw immediately. So now they're withdrawing in disorder. Well, Johnston and Beauregard are still around there, and they order Hampton's Legion. He has 600 men, but Hampton has purchased with his own money 400 Enfield rifles. So his troops are armed with a better weapon. And they begin to have longer range fire, and they're better trained too, by the way. They begin to have longer range fire, and they use their rifles to begin to slow the Union advance. Also at this time, McDowell makes the decision that he needs to hold up his line a little bit and bring up his artillery. This wastes about 2 hours. Again, had he not wasted that time, there would have been a much better chance that the North would win this battle. But again, they make a bad decision. Well, Jackson now is ordered up into the line with his 2,000 men, and he manages to scrape up, he's on Henry Hill, by the way. He manages to scrape up 13 pieces of artillery. And what he does is he puts the artillery at the top of the hill, puts his troops behind the hill. So they are not being affected by Union fire. And then when his cannon fire, they roll back down the hill a little bit, and they can be reloaded without being subject to Union attack. So he's got himself into a pretty good position there. And there begins an artillery fight. The Union has a significant portion, as we talked about last week, of rifle-barreled artillery. Well, the Union, I don't think at this time, but since they just got these, I mean, they were from, really, the Parrott rifle, for example, was developed in 1861, so they must have just gotten these weapons. So I don't think they were properly trained or thought about what was really going on with these weapons. And they take their cannon and move them up to within 300 yards of the Confederate line. Well, at 300 yards, you've totally lost the advantage you have of your long-range artillery. And not to mention that the Confederates are behind the hills, so it's difficult to shoot at them. Well, what causes then is that the Union troops' cannon are getting just blasted by the Confederates, because the Confederates are above them, they're way too close, and they've lost the effect of their rifled guns. But B is still trying to retreat. And B comes up and says to his men, he goes, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians." Well, that's what history tells us. There's another story about this, though. First of all, B is killed at the battle. He is wounded in the stomach and dies the next day. None of his troops or his subordinate officers really ever file any detailed report as to what went on in this battle. So there's not a lot of good information here. What has come from actually another gentleman in the Confederate Army was that B was mad at Jackson because Jackson was up on the hill building this line. And B wanted Jackson to come down and help him fight on the lower area. And so what has been said about this is indeed what he actually meant was, look at that Jackson, he's just staying up there. I need him down here. He's standing up there like a stone wall. So the question actually is does Stonewall Jackson, was that a good name or a bad name? But he turns out to be a great general anyway. So, and actually he made the right decision by the way he played his cards. So, but B necessarily wasn't particularly happy with him. Well, Jackson's men are primarily armed with smoothbore muskets. They do not have rifles at this time. And he tells them, reserve your fire until they come within 50 yards, then fire and give them the bayonet, and when you charge, yell like furies. And that is where the very famous rebel yell comes from. So we've got two big pieces here. We've got Stonewall either doing a good job or a bad job, and we've got the rebel yell. So both of those come from this time. All right. Well, the Union artillery, one of the commanders, Griffin, decides to move two of his guns because they're getting slaughtered. And he's going to try to do enfilade, so in other words, he's going to try to shoot at the Confederates from the side. And he moves his guns, a couple of guns, to get into position. He's getting ready to fire. And they see a bunch of guys dressed in blue coming towards him. And his boss, Barry, says, wait a minute, don't shoot at those guys. They're dressed in blue. They're Union troops. Well, they're not. They are Confederates. And because at this time people didn't necessarily have standardized uniforms, they misconstrue who they're fighting, and the guns are then captured. Jackson sees this and says, okay, he launches an attack all across his line. And which is a very bold move on his part because the Confederates are actually outnumbered 2-1. So there's much more Union force there than the Confederates, but the Confederates make a bold charge, run down the hill, and capture the bulk of the guns that are Union guns that have been having such a tough time anyway. And then Cox Brigade shows up at 4 p.m. and they push the rest of the Union troops off of the Henry Hill. Well, remember I told you about Smith. So basically what's going on there, Kirby Smith has now got his troops in line, having come in by train that morning, and they join up with Early and Stewart. And the Union has this formation by Howard right there. Well, what they do is they get around Howard's flank and they crush Howard's unit. That's a big problem for the Union, because what's going to happen next is Jackson and Cooke and everybody go charging after the Union line after the defeat at Henry Hill, and now with the flank turned, the entire Union army begins to disintegrate. They all begin to retreat back towards whence they come in Centerville. So it's getting to be a very bad situation for the Union. Well, McDowell tries to rally his forces. He's out there doing his best to stop this rout, and he's totally unable to do it. But he does have one advantage. He has a regular unit, and that's under Porter. So this is regular Army. These aren't 90-day guys or volunteers. These guys have been in the Army for a long time. He stations that unit at this crossroads, and they temporarily hold up the Confederate advance. Well, the retreat's pretty orderly until they get to this bridge. And then the Confederates have brought up artillery. The artillery begins to shell the bridge. They hit a wagon. The wagon overturns, blocks the bridge, and the rest of the Union Army starts to panic again. And they begin to throw away their weapons and try to swim across the river. So now they're disarmed. They have numerous people are captured because they can't get across the river because they're all in this big panic. Probably not a good idea to throw your weapons away, my thinking. I could be wrong. But, so, anyway, what has also happened this day, a very famous event, is numerous Congress people and wealthy people from Washington have taken their carriages out and a picnic lunch, and they're going to go witness this battle. This is going to be like entertainment for them. So, can't picture that myself, but anyway, they do that, and when they see the Union Army all running away, they decide, oh hell, we better get out of Dodge here. So they begin to panic and flee, and they start to block the entire road out of this area. Well, in the South, that maneuver is known as the Great Skedaddle. So another one of those moments in history where panic leads to a bit of history. Well, what happens then is Jefferson Davis shows up. I mean, it's like a party out here. And Jefferson Davis shows up and he sees the Union troops all running away, and he's like goes after Beauregard and Johnson and says, look, you guys got to get on their tail right now. We can have a huge victory. We can basically destroy their entire army. Unfortunately, the Confederate Army is not much better trained than the Union Army, and they're completely disorganized by this victory. So Jeff is so mad that he starts an inquiry in the Confederate Army about their failure to follow up properly on this battle. So, First Bull Run is a victory indeed for the Confederates, but it's really poorly run on both sides. There's 35,000 Union troops in this battle. Only 18,000 become involved. There's 32,000 Confederate soldiers in this battle. Only 18,000 become involved. So neither side really has done itself a lot of favors by the way they've run this battle. Casualties are relatively similar. There's more captured, 1,200 MIAs. Most of those were prisoners. So there's a little bit more lost by the Union. Not a tremendous difference. Very low casualties really by what will go on later in the war. But more interesting is the Confederates capture 17 rifled cannon. They capture 8 smoothbore cannons. So they've picked up 25 very valuable pieces of equipment here. And they've picked up numerous arms, numerous supplies when the Great Skedaddle happened. So it's really more of a logistics victory for the South. One more interesting thing about this battle is not only did we have telegraphs, not only did we have railroads, we also have aviation. Well, so we've got Thaddeus Lowe here, and he's an aeronaut, and he wants to fly a balloon from the United States to Europe. And his cohorts say, you know, maybe you better test this thing a little bit before we try to do this. And so they talk him into moving west because the winds normally blow west to east, and say, look, why don't you go further out west? So he goes to Cincinnati and hooks up his balloon and gets up in the air and flies 900 miles and lands in the Carolinas. Well, by this time, the war has started, and he is captured as a Union spy. A professor at a local university knows him and says to the Confederates, he goes, no, 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 no. This guy is not a spy, he's just a scientist, so they let him go. Well, he's very, very unhappy about this whole situation, and now he's going to devote himself to the Union cause. He takes his balloon to Washington, D.C., he hooks it up by the White House, they raise it 500 feet up in the air, they run a telegraph cable down, and he sends a message to President Lincoln that he is at his service to help fight the war. Well, McDowell sees this and says, hey, you know, I like this balloon a lot. I think I want it to come with me to Manassas. And Lowe's like, well, you know, we really should have a balloon that's more militarized rather than my Enterprise balloon. It's not really suitable for this purpose. But he had just told Lincoln that he was at his service, so he says, okay, fine, I'll go. Well, he does. And so when this great skedaddle is going on, McDowell says, look, I need you to see if the Confederate Army is chasing us. So they launch the balloon. He sees indeed that the Confederate Army is not following up, and so that lets the Union slow its pace and become much more organized when they get back to Washington. He actually gets over the Confederate line. His balloon goes down behind the Confederate line, but he is fortunately rescued by Union cavalry, and he then goes on to form the U.S. Army Balloon Corps. And with that, let's take a short break. All right. Battle of Malvern Hill. This is the very famous, this is the last battle of the very famous battles of the 7 days. What has happened is the Union Army is now under a gentleman by the name of McClellan. McClellan has decided to move the bulk of what is now known as the Army of the Potomac via river to attack Richmond from the east, kind of the southeast, east. So instead of going down from the north to south, he's going to use the river and he's going to attack. He kind of botches the job. He doesn't move quickly when he should have. And eventually, Robert E. Lee takes command of what will eventually be the Army of Northern Virginia, and he begins to defeat McClellan and the Union Army in the famous Battle of the 7 Days. So, McClellan has decided that Lee's army is much bigger than his because he's been misinformed by the Pinkerton detectives that are running the Union Intelligence Corps. And he's going to reorganize his forces, but what he does is he leaves a significant portion of troops at a place called Malvern Hill. Malvern Hill, and we'll see it on a map on the next page, but anyway, what happens here is Lee thinks that the Union troops are so demoralized that he can win a total victory. He can crush them. And A.P. Hill, one of his commanders, says, you know, I don't think this is a good idea. I think maybe we should not attack Malvern Hill. Lee is hell-bent on this and says, you know what, my infantry is so good I can beat anybody. Well, the Union has stationed 54,000 men on Malvern Hill. They have 171 cannon plus 91 cannon in reserve. A.P. Hill is incredibly right. This is not a good plan for an attack because Lee only has 55,000 men, so he only has virtually no superiority. He's going to bombard them with 60 cannon, so he has an there's a lot of disparity there in power. So to launch an offensive against people up on high ground that have been making a position that have 171 cannon and you're going to attack them with 60 is not particularly a good idea. And you can see this in the battle here. This is how this worked out. So anyway, there's Richmond. Here's Harrison's Landing. That's where McClellan is intending to go. And that's Malvern Hill. So you can see that originally the fights were at Seven Pines and White's Tavern. So they've been driving the Union back towards Harrison's Landing. So bombardment begins, but the Confederate cannon are primarily smoothbores. And they're vastly outnumbered. The Union cannon are in a much better position. They are shooting longer, and they begin to decimate the Confederate artillery. What happens then is that they launch their attack, and the attack is spearheaded by a gentleman named Armistead. And many of you will be familiar with Armistead from the famous Battle of Gettysburg, where he is killed on the last day. But anyway, Armistead's men are pinned down by the Union artillery. They are in a hollow in the ground. And so they're laying down while these cannonballs are coming over them, and they're in a very tough position. Lee is misinformed. He is told that Armistead has been successful. Well, unfortunately, what he now begins to do is to feed more and more troops in piecemeal, thinking that he's going to achieve this victory. Well, that's not what happens. So as more and more troops go into this battle, more and more become pinned down. And now he realizes that he's in a big mess. And he says, you know, what we got to do now is we got to send more troops in to try to get these troops out. Well, all that's doing now is making more and more casualties. So if we look at this picture, what they did was they've taken Malvern Hill and tried to put it back to the way it would have looked in the time of the battle in 1862. You can see that the field of fire there is just wide open. So to go charging into 171 cannon into that kind of a condition is not probably a good way to have a victory. So it's a tremendous tactical defeat for the South. They take a tremendous amount of casualties that they cannot afford. The Union generals tell McClellan, hey, look, we got a big advantage here now. Lee's in trouble. We should launch an immediate counterattack. McClellan, again, because he believes what the Pinkertons have told him, that Lee has 200,000 men instead of 55,000, he says, no, we have to retreat back to Harrison's Landing. So what happens then is that the end of the 7 days occurs because, first of all, Lee is in absolutely no position to launch another attack, and McClellan doesn't want to launch another attack because he's afraid of how many troops that Lee might have. Well, so what does this demonstrate? It demonstrates that cannon, particularly rifled cannon, are now becoming much more potent weapon on the battlefield. So for you to attack into the face of massed artillery fire is going to be a disaster. And 50% of the casualties of the Confederates are caused by artillery fire, which is pretty much unheard of until this battle. Well, another thing about the Battle of Malvern Hill is now we've begun to see more and more people equipped with rifled muskets. Remember, in the first Battle of Manassas, many troops were not. In fact, rifled muskets do not totally replace units, particularly for some of the volunteer and some of the local militias during the entire Civil War. Many people are still armed with smoothbores, even by the end of the war. But the rifle now is becoming much more common. So the 1861 Springfield is pretty much equipping. Mass production is able to drive enough machine tools to make enough of these weapons to make them much more available. The South uses the 1853 Enfield muzzled rifle. They buy the Austrian Lorenz muzzled rifle, and of course they capture numerous Springfields from the Union when they can. So many, many units are now beginning to use rifles, not just muskets. Well, there's a lot of argument about this, though, particularly recent history. Is indeed the rifle making that big a difference at this time in warfare? And there's a couple reasons why people think that perhaps that it is not. The first piece is the way that you sight a rifle at this time. It does not have adjustable sights that are geared for certain yardages. It just has one sight. So in order to fire a difference between 100 yards and 300 yards, you would have to lift that barrel a little bit higher to get the bullet or the ball to go further. Well, that takes a significant amount of training, and these guys don't have a significant amount of training, the vast majority of them. Some people do. The other issue is, of course, the smoke of black powder. Black powder smoke is certainly a detriment on the battlefield. So the argument has been almost traditionally that Napoleonic tactics of using men in a line was totally ineffective and because of rifled weapons, and that's all had to be rethought. With smoke and not the ability not to hit things at a particularly large distance, that is argued that indeed that's not the case, that Napoleonic tactics were still effective. I personally tend to think that yes, there's some truth to this argument, but I don't think it's as much as people would make it to be. I think indeed the rifle did have a significant effect on this war. So you can take it any way you look at it. But what's really interesting here is that the rifled musket is incredibly effective in the hands of somebody who's well trained. And there would be specific units of sharpshooters. There would be specific units of skirmishers who would be out in front. So they're out in front, so they're not going to be subject to massive amounts of smoke early on. So these people, and of course sharpshooters are basically like snipers. And they're not going to be affected tremendously early on in a battle either by smoke. So they can be very, very effective. Well, early on in these battles, when particularly Napoleonic era, same thing, at the end of the day, if you've been marching to battle and the end of the day has come and you decide, well, you know, it's time for us to knock off. So I would go pitch my tent and I would make myself a little dinner. Well, by this time, that's getting to be not such a good idea because of the distance of weapons and the firepower advantages. Now what you do is you begin to dig field fortifications. So the minute you stop for the night, it's like modern warfare really, you start digging a foxhole. Well, in these days, you start digging a trench. So everybody would start digging this trench so they would be more defended because they had learned by 1864 particularly that field fortifications were the difference between life and death. Now, if you were going to attack a field fortification, what would happen is you would see it and say, uh-oh, there's a field fortification, so what do you want to do? You're going to either want to try to flank it, get behind it, get alongside of it so it's not in your face. You either want to then bring up massive amounts of artillery to begin to suppress the fire from that trench, or you will pay the price of a frontal assault and take massive amounts of casualties. So you can see here that these fortifications are very, very primitive. Well, when you have a significant amount of time, you will begin to make much better fortifications, particularly at around a town called Petersburg. And Petersburg was fortified well before the battle actually started. Primarily, these trenches at Petersburg were built by slaves. They built a thing called the Dimmock Line. The Dimmock Line was 10 miles long and had 55 redoubts. So it was very, very strong position. And with enough time, you would really make these things formidable, and you would make them so if you look at this picture, you can see that you're able to stand erect. There's a firing step for you to get up and fire on, and then there's a thing called the headlog. At this time, guns were very, very low velocity, so they couldn't really penetrate a log with there were no armor-piercing bullets, for example. So you would basically be able to peek out of this thing and shoot, and you would be very, very well protected from particularly infantry fire. The other thing you could do if you really had a lot of time is you would dig a trench in front of your trench, and then you would put these, or chevaux de frise. Okay, so, excuse me, chevaux de frise. So you would put those in there, and you would be very, very protected from infantry coming at you. Because why would you use these? Well, barbed wire hasn't been invented yet. It's not invented until 1867. That brings us to later in the war, so now we're into 1864, and Grant is now in charge of the Union Army. And there's a major battle here at the Wilderness, and the Battle of the Wilderness is fought for a lot of reasons because the Union artillery is not going to be as effective in this type of terrain as it would be in, say, an open field like Malvern Hill. So Lee is always trying at this point in the war to limit casualties and limit the capabilities of the artillery of the Union Army. Well, so this battle is relatively ineffective on both sides. Nothing really major happens. And what would normally occur at this time is that the Union Army would withdraw. The Union Army would withdraw and reorganize. Grant at this time decides, no, we are no longer going to do that. We are now going to have total war. We are going to have a war of attrition. We are going to continue to fight until we can destroy the South by just wearing them down. And what he then does is, instead of marching back and reorganizing his army, he marches south to Spotsylvania Courthouse, because what he wants to do there is he would be between Lee and the city of Richmond, and this would force Lee to attack him. And he knows that if Lee attacks him, he will destroy the Southern Army. Well, fortunately, what happens is that the Confederate cavalry beat the Union to what's known as Laurel Hill, and that's this box here. So there's the big box, and then here's how that actually looks. And what they want to do there is they stop the Union Army before they can get in close, and they immediately start to dig, and the Confederates are now digging like crazy. And on May 8th, the Union main body catches up and launches an assault against this position, and indeed, they are repulsed. Well, the Confederates now on May 8th and 9th, that evening, are still digging and digging and digging and digging. And they actually, by that next morning, have created a temporary field work that is 4 miles long. And they continue to extend this thing, but what happens is there's some high ground. And they don't want the Union artillery to get on that high ground. So what they're forced to do is they're forced to make not a straight line, but this strange looking line that has a big salient in it. And that salient will be known as the Mule Shoe. And this will become incredibly important to this battle. So at 9 a.m. the next day, Sedgwick, who had led the corps for the first attack, is out inspecting his troops, and he tells them, because they're under fire from sharpshooters, and he goes, they couldn't hit an elephant at this range. Only seconds later, he's hit in the head and killed instantly. So, indeed, I think sharpshooters had a little bit more to say about what was going on at this time than perhaps some of the more modern historians think. Sedgwick certainly didn't appreciate it. Well, anyway, Grant realized that he was in the wrong position, and so this continues to delay his offensive. And of course, while he's delaying his offensive, what are the Confederates doing? They're digging. And they're digging and digging and digging. And they're making this line bigger and bigger and stronger. And there's a Meade, those of you that know Gettysburg know Meade was in charge of Gettysburg. He authorizes a preliminary assault, which never should have occurred. And that fails miserably, and now Grant is forced to delay his attack till 6 p.m. Well, and you can see what's going on here. Here's the Mule Shoe, So you can see instead of a nice straight line here, you've got this line here because there's some high ground they didn't want to give up to the Union artillery. Well, what else is going on? You've got Burnside over here, another less than stellar commander. It's those of you that follow this. Burnside, by the way, sideburns are named after Burnside. He has his entire corps facing one Confederate division. He makes and he's in a great position to capture Spotsylvania, which is right there. And what happens is he makes an attack and he goes, "Oh, we're getting kind of a lot of fire here. I think we should call it off and just start digging a trench." So a golden opportunity is lost by the Union to indeed win this battle and basically destroy Lee's army. Well, finally at 6 p.m. we're going to launch this attack. And what is going on with this attack? It's going to be led by a special unit by this gentleman, Colonel Emory Upton. He's way ahead of his time. He has 5,000 hand-picked men, and he has seen a spot in the Muleshoe that looks like it's an opportunity for a good place to attack, as good as possible. And he says to his 5,000 guys, he goes, "You know, we're going to do something different. We're not going to march along and then shoot and then go forward and march along and shoot. What we're going to do is we're going to load our guns, and when I give the order, all 5,000 of you are going to run like hell, and you're going to get up to that line as fast as you possibly can, and you're going to then shoot and attack with the bayonet." The idea there, obviously, is to limit casualties from defensive fire from these earthworks. Well, it works really good. The Confederates are floored by this. All of a sudden, all these Union guys are just running at them and not shooting. And they're shooting, but it takes so long, remember, to load a musket that they can't get enough rounds off to really stop this attack. And Upton's men break into the Muleshoe, break into the line, and they're in really good position. What happens? Failure of command and control. The division that's supposed to support Upton under Mott completely fails to follow up. In fact, Mott does such an incredibly bad job that he is demoted. And what happens then? Lee sends in reinforcements and drives Upton's unit out of the Muleshoe, and the Confederates hold the Muleshoe. What he has developed is a precursor to tactics that will be used significantly at the end of World War I by the Germans. They are called stormtrooper tactics, and what that is to take small units and infiltrate through lines. So he has really come up with an advantage here of how to use his infantry in the face of massed firepower. Grant is really impressed with this, and what does he do? He says, "Well, that worked pretty darn well. I think, you know what we ought to do? I think we ought to take a whole corps and have them run at the Muleshoe all at one time and not fire until they get there." And that's what they do a couple days later. Well, again, this looks like a really good idea, and the initial assault is incredibly successful. But what they haven't really thought out is how to have command and control of those units once they break into the Muleshoe. They don't have a plan. They don't have a way to communicate with those people. Again, you'll see this over and over in World War I. They don't have the possibilities of modern communications to control the battle once it starts. This leads to a disaster, because what happens is now you've got 15,000 Union soldiers in a space that's only a half a mile wide that have now become a giant armed mob, and what breaks out is a huge melee. And that melee turns into a thing that's famously known as the Bloody Angle. So both sides now are trying to feed more and more troops into this little tiny space. Bad plan. And what happens then is that the Confederate engineers are trying to dig a new line 500 yards behind the front of the Bloody Angle where Hancock's corps has broken through. This goes on for 24 hours of hand-to-hand fighting. It's really an incredibly, if you read accounts of it, it's really horrific. So all the other attacks It's not just this one attack by Hancock, but the entire Union Army has tried to attack these positions. But they don't use these tactics. They use their standard tactics, and they are repulsed all along the rest of the line. So you can see that the defensive positions that the Confederates were allowed to have time to prepare are actually very, very effective. Yes?
So they were fighting like that in the dark.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, it was a terrible, horrific battle.
You couldn't see who they were.
They didn't much care. It was literally just a free-for-all. It was, if you read accounts of the Bloody Angle, it's really it's an awful battle. And again, it went on for 24 hours while the Confederate engineers are digging a trench behind them. And finally, they order their men to withdraw. Pretty grim. So that one day, you've got 9,000 casualties by the Union and 8,000 casualties by the South in that one day. Well, Spotsylvania turns out to be a bloodbath. There's 32,000 total casualties over the entire battle. There's 18,000 roughly for the Union. There's just under 13,000 for the South. The Union, though, can afford these casualties. The South cannot. I put this picture up. I thought it was interesting. It's about Cold Harbor, which we'll talk about briefly here. But what this is this is a stereoscopic. Those of you may remember having a stereo viewer where things would appear to be 3D. And apparently at this time, because these pictures are identical, people must have been fascinated with seeing dead people and pictures like this, because there's numerous things of Brady and Gardner taking pictures of dead. And I thought it was interesting that they would actually make a stereoscopic view of skulls and dead bodies. But apparently that was popular back then, and it was obviously for sale. You would buy these. So what happens next is Lee is in a tough position, and Grant, again, with total war going on, begins to move again towards Richmond. And he goes to a place called Cold Harbor, again trying to get behind Lee to get between him and Richmond. Well, again, the Confederates beat him to Cold Harbor, have enough time to dig trenches, and the Union begins to launch frontal assaults into the face of massed firepower. The casualties are roughly 3 to 1, 3 Union dead or wounded for every Southerner. After the war, Grant writes his memoirs, and he says if he has one regret from the war, it's that he launched these attacks at Cold Harbor, because they were a disaster, they were a bloody mess. So, now what happens next is the siege of Petersburg. Again, I told you about Petersburg being the main rail line into Richmond. If you capture Petersburg, Richmond cannot be held. It will automatically fall because it cannot be supplied. There is another army of the Union under Butler, another terrible general. He has 15,000 men, and he is trying to come and to sneak into Petersburg as fast as he can. Remember, there's that Dimmock line I talked to you about. It's 10 miles of fortifications. There's 4,000 Confederates holding the Dimmock line against 15,000 Union troops, but it's long. It's 10 miles long. 4,000 people could not hold a 10-mile line. Union cavalry actually breaks into Petersburg, but Butler is so timid and so disorganized that he had a golden opportunity to capture Petersburg and totally fails to capture it, even though he outnumbers them basically 4 to 1. Well, Grant comes up, and Grant brings 67,000 men. At this time, Lee can only bring 20,000, but the Dimmock line is so strong and so well built that 20,000 men in this Dimmock line, because now they can actually hold 10 miles, defeat 67,000 Union soldiers because they're so well entrenched into this thing. So The siege begins of Petersburg, very famous. It goes on for 9 months. The trench line eventually becomes 30 miles long, and it becomes reminiscent pretty much of World War I, as we view World War I. The North attempts something that we will also see in World War I, is they dig under the line, they make galleries, they pack those galleries with explosives, they run a fuse out, and they blow up a whole large section of the Confederate line. Again, through terrible command and control, because it's very difficult at this time to have command and control because there's, for example, no radios. The total thing fails. The Union, one of the Union commanders is actually drunk. He's intoxicated. The troops get into the crater and are then slaughtered by the Confederates. It just turns into a disaster. It's another grim battle at this time. And what goes on, though, is Lee is getting less and less support from the Confederate states, and we'll talk about why in a second. And more Union troops are beginning to extend the line. So he's running out of troops to hold the trench lines. And finally, his exhausted army is forced to retreat, abandoned Richmond, and they retreat to, of course, Appomattox, which will be the end of the war. Well, why is all this going on at this point? Is because of Sherman. And Sherman is considered to be one of the most modern aspects, really. He is really going to have total war. He is not only going to destroy the Confederate Army, Sherman is going to destroy the Confederate infrastructure, industry, and farms. He is going to indeed have a scorched earth policy to destroy the Confederacy's ability to continue the war. And he doesn't really care much about anything of what he's destroying. He does have some scruples, but generally it's not the best. Well, he has burned Atlanta and decides what I'm going to do next is I'm going to march across Georgia, and I'm going to leave in my path a wake of destruction. I'm going to cut the entire Confederacy into 2 parts, and I'm going to destroy their infrastructure, particularly their railroads. Remember, they're already struggling with their railroads at this time because of engines. They don't have very many left because they can't get parts, they can't make new stuff. So they're really in a tough situation. Now, Lincoln and the Army under Grant are like, I don't know if this is a good idea. You're just going to go marching off without a line of supply. But they figure, you know what, Sherman seems to know what he's doing, and they reluctantly agree to let Sherman march across Georgia without a supply line. Well, he takes 20 days of supplies, and then what he's going to do is he's going to live off the land, and he has special troops that are foragers. They are sent out to gather supplies of food and whatever that they need, horses, and bring them in. And these people get to be the very famous term bummers. So the bummers indeed are foragers or people that are sent out to obtain supplies for this march to the sea and this path of destruction that he will leave across all of Georgia. Well, Sherman also does something else that's very, very modern, something that we did in World War II, and I'm sure still do today, is we look at data to see where the best places to attack. So if we were going to bomb Germany, for example, we would try to get as much information on factories that we were going to bomb. And this was done well before World War II started. And they would bring in industry people, you know, in certain industries and find out where was a thing that we could blow up and destroy from air power, and that would be the most effect on the enemy's ability to make things, how we can destroy their industry, for example, ball bearings and fuel. Well, Sherman does the same thing. He looks at the 1860 census and says, you know, if I go through this part of Georgia, I can destroy this area. There's railroad here, I can destroy that. So he actually uses the census and uses very, very modern data to destroy the infrastructure of the South. Well, he also says this, though, because he doesn't, I wouldn't say he was Robin Hood by any means here, but the fact of the matter is, he goes, as for horses, mules, wagons, discriminating, however, between the rich, who are usually hostile, and the poor or industrious, usually neutral or friendly. So he specifically tells his people to make this class warfare. He is going to destroy the property of the rich and hopefully leave something for the poor. Not necessarily, but he at least had the thought process of that. Well, so he moves across the country, destroying this huge swath of Georgia. They start to get more and more freed slaves. Well, the question is, what are you going to do with these freed slaves? Because they're not really in a position to feed and support them, because again, they're living off the land. So he says, Negroes who are able-bodied and can be of service to the several columns may be taken along. But each army commander will bear in mind that the question of supplies is very important, one, and that his first duty is to see to them who bear arms. So you have to support your military first, not these slaves. So this causes a significant problem for the freed slaves, because they have no protection, really, once they get out of this position. So there's a lot here, but at least you see that he had really made no provision to have a capability to take care of these people, which is understandable, but the fact of the matter is, it certainly was tough on those freed slaves. So, when Sherman arrives in Savannah, he has cut the South in two. He has destroyed the infrastructure of central Georgia. He has destroyed Atlanta. And the South realizes that the war indeed is over, that they cannot possibly win. And as I told you very early in this class today, I showed you rails. What they would do is they would build these piles of wood, they would put the rails on them, they would light them on fire, that would heat the iron, and then you can see that they would bend those rails so they would be impossible to use again for a railroad. Well, the war is lost. So what do we learn today about this? And I'm going to ask you this question. Is the American Civil War the first modern land war? Anyone thoughts? I would say it's pretty close. But I would also say that in my opinion, it is not. It's real close. You can see a lot of aspects of World War I. You can see a lot of aspects of weapons, you know, rifled cannon, rifled gun, personal armament. You can see trains have been used. You can see the telegraph has been used. You can even see balloons have been used. But the fact of the matter is, there are certain key aspects of this that make me feel that this is not the first modern land war. And that would be the fact that, first of all, they are using black powder. So that takes away a lot of long-range fire, and it takes away a lot of ability to observe where your fire lands. They are not using, there's too much smoke. Also, artillery shells, only very few of them have contact fuses, so when you fire a shell, it hits the ground and blows up. Most of the armament here fired is not explosive. Some of it is, but it's very, very difficult to control. And lastly, the one I think the most important thing, or at least one of the most important things about why this is not the first modern land war, is there are no machine guns. The machine gun has not been invented. Yes, indeed, the Gatling gun predates this, but we will talk about that at another time. Yes, sir?
I disagree, and I'll tell you why.
Okay, you may.
I look at this as a modern industrial war. The North, basically, if you think about it, mass conscription. It was not a failure of morale, it's a failure of logistics and the ability to wait.
I don't disagree with that, but in this...
And I look at that as modern war.
Okay, you certainly can. But this class is about weaponry.
Right, but I mean, I look at it in terms of strategy with the weapons at hand, compared to Napoleonics, where it was basically a failure of morale, not logistics and ability to wage war. This was a destruction of the ability to wage war through total economic warfare, going back to Winfield Scott's original plan.
Yes, we will discuss that next week. The Anaconda Plan will indeed be part of next, well, I think that's 2 weeks out, actually. But the fact of the matter is we will discuss the Anaconda Plan and the naval blockade, which indeed, I agree with you in that regard. But as far as the weaponry itself of modern warfare, I do not agree with you that way. I think it's just too much smoke. The weapons are not accurate enough. There's not modern communication. There's no steel. None of that things that would make World War I in effect, and the internal combustion engine making land warfare mobile again, sort of in World War I, but certainly by World War II, you would see both of those factors being what I would consider modern war. Because without internal combustion engines, well, certainly, you're certainly entitled to your opinion.
No, I look at it as I'm looking at it as the strategy of warfare, and you're looking at it in some of the technological aspects.
Right, that's what this class was to be. Is to be a technological class. But indeed, you could look at many battles, many over millennium, where people have destroyed the infrastructure, of burned the crops. You could see that in Napoleon's advance into Russia. The Russians scorched the earth there to destroy, so he limited his food supply. Napoleon's troops are actually in Moscow starving to death, and many of them starved to death and die of disease on their way back out, and that's all due to the Russians scorching earth. So you can look at it that way too. So is that total war? Yeah. But my class is, again, and it's just my class, it's designed to be about technology. Okay?
Sure.
All right. Well, anyway, next week we will be talking about naval warfare. We will switch gears and get off of this topic and go to how navies were, and we will discuss the Battle of Trafalgar. Okay, thank you so much.